So we're going to continue on here looking now at the midbrain structures. So the midbrain structures include things like the hippocampus, the thalamus and thalamic nuclei, the hypothalamus with the pituitary, the corpus callosum with its fornix, the pineal gland, the mammillary body, and the collicules. In the packet, I've given you a big table of all of the hypothalamic nuclei and a big table of all the thalamic nuclei, as well as a list of all of the structures within the midbrain. These we sometimes will refer to as the limbic system, and it's going to be involved with our ability to form memories, our ability to have automatic response to homeostatic disruption. It's also going to be involved with the endocrine response to homeostatic disruption. It's going to be involved with fear response within some of the within some of the limbic system, in particular within the amygdala. So the first thing we're going to look at here is looking at a sagittal cut of the cerebral cortex, where we can go ahead and see the corpus callosum and the fornix. The corpus callosum and fornix are nothing more than a whole bunch of axons that are allowing the right and left hemispheres to communicate with each other. For the fornix, it's going to be more involved with the limbic system as well as the insula, whereas the corpus callosum is going to be more involved with the lobular region of the cerebral cortex. That connection point is going to ensure that the left hemisphere knows exactly what the right hemisphere is doing, and the right hemisphere knows exactly what the left hemisphere is doing. If people have epilepsy, what we can do is we can go ahead and split the corpus callosum, and it seems to alleviate a lot of the symptoms of epilepsy. But the problem is it leads to hemispherical neglect, which means that we don't have that lateralization that we'll talk about when we look at the cerebral cortical lobes themselves, the forebrain. Now, if you notice, just inferior to the fornix, we get what's referred to as the choroid plexus. The choroid plexus is going to be responsible for production of cerebrospinal fluid. The cerebral cortex floats within the cranial bones, and it's the fluid that's being generated by the choroid plexus, as well as a couple other regions of generation that's going to ensure that it's suspended properly. We'll talk about that when we talk about cerebrospinal fluid. We have the thalamus and the thalamic nuclei. We have the pineal gland and the tectal plate, which includes the collicules. We have the hypothalamus and the mammillary body. And coming off of the hypothalamus, we have the pituitary. All of those are going to be involved as either a relay network, the thalamus in particular, or in terms of a regulatory network, in particularly the hypothalamus, the mammillary body, and the pituitary gland. Now, the pineal glands can be involved with our sleep-wake cycles as well as our response to food, as it's going to be induced to release a protein hormone that's going to cause us to become lethargic as we overconsume food. So here we're looking at a posterior view of the midbrain structures. So notice we have the thalamus as the most superior part of this. Coming away from these midbrain structures, we have the cerebellar peduncles, which is going to head back to the cerebellum. We then get to the tectal plate, which is going to include the collicules. Now notice everything inferior to the collicules is all part of that hindbrain structure, and once again goes back to the earlier diagram that I talked about. You can't separate any of these brain structures because they're going to be in constant cross communication with each other. So now we're looking at it in terms of a frontal view. And so notice we have at the most superior edge the thalamus being held in place by the intrathalamic adhesion. Then we have the cerebellar peduncles coming away. Notice at the very center we have the optic chiasm. That's right where the sella trabeca happens to be within the cranial bones. In that area we have the mammillary bodies as well as the hypothalamus and pituitary. And once again, if you notice, right inferior to those areas we have the hindbrain structures with all of the cranial nerves heading out from there. Now, two of the more interesting limbic system bodies are shown here in this diagram. That includes the amygdala and the hippocampus. Now, the amygdala and the hippocampus are involved with learning responses as well as our fear response. It doesn't make us aggressive, even though people talk about it making us aggressive. What it does is it regulates how we respond to fear. Now, what's really interesting is that these two areas act antagonistically to each other, which means that if one is being stimulated, the other one's being inhibited. The more excitation one of those two get, the more atrophy we'll see in the other. And what's happening is that hippocampus is involved with learning and memory, whereas amygdala is involved with our fear response. If you're in an environment that has excessive amounts of stress, what ends up happening is that the amygdala becomes excessively hypertrophied. You become excessively fearful. And the hippocampus becomes atrophied. So we end up having amygdala hypertrophication and hippocampal atrophy. And this limits how well someone is able to learn and control emotional responses. On the other end, if we live in an environment that is loving and nurturing, the hippocampus becomes hypertrophied and the amygdala becomes atrophied. This person is able to interact with people more socially, is able to learn and control their emotions more readily. Now, what's interesting is that we think about the environment as being outside environment, but what they've found is that it's not necessarily the outside environment. It's the family environment, where if you come from a household where mommy loves you and daddy loves you and brother and sister care about you and auntie takes care of you and nana takes care of you, the hippocampus becomes more hypertrophied and the amygdala becomes more atrophied. On the other end, if you come from a household where mom and dad don't care whether you come home at night, where you are raised by the nanny as opposed to having the maternal contact that we need as infants, the opposite holds true, where the amygdala becomes hypertrophied and the hippocampus becomes atrophied. Now, there's a couple other nuclei that come into play here, including the cingulate gyrus, as well as the putnam. Those areas are involved with our ability to regulate our behavior as it relates to dopamine secretions, which we're going to talk about here in a second. Those areas are the areas that become excessively needing of dopamine, what we call fixes, as it relates to behaviors, leading to risk and reward behaviors associated with addictions, and why most of you cannot put down your phones for more than 3 minutes. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a look at a couple of important pathways coming out of the midbrain as it relates to what's referred to as the neurotransmitter pathways. The first one is the dopaminergic pathway. So notice where the dopaminergic pathway is coming from. It's heading out into the limbic system from the tectal plate region, the mesencephalonic region. What the dopaminergic pathway is involved with is it's involved with motor control. It's involved with the regulation of mood, emotion, and motivation. It's going to be involved with memory. It's going to be involved with hormone production. It's going to be involved with reward responses and addictions. Now notice, most of this pathway is heading out into the frontal cortex, in particular into the areas which we usually refer to as the prefrontal cortex. But then it's also going to head out into the areas that we just talked about that are associated with the limbic system and the necessity to have a risk or reward. This is the pathway that gets stimulated that makes you want to do things over and over and over again. This is the same pathway that's involved with motor control, where people who have Parkinson's or Parkinsonian issues will have dopaminergic problems. The other type of problem that could come about is people who have attention deficit issues may have a dopaminergic problem with the attention deficit issue, leading to their need to constantly find new things in order to have a greater reward, meaning their motivation is linked to dopamine issues. The next pathway is the noradrenergic pathway. Notice it's kind of come from the same areas, however, it's more within the reticular activating system that we talked about within the hindbrain. Notice it's flowing all through the cerebral cortex. Just like with dopamine, this is an excitatory neurotransmitter, which means it's going to activate things. This leads to fluxes of autonomic tone peripherally, but it leads to activation within the cerebral cortex. This activation of the cerebral cortex can activate the dopaminergic pathway, leading to changes of behavior. Just as with dopamine is associated and dopaminergic pathways are associated with attention deficit issue, so is the noradrenergic pathway. So we're looking at here is we're looking at the serotonergic pathway. So the serotonergic pathway is the pathway that's going to be counter to the other two pathways that we just looked at. The serotonergic pathway is primarily an inhibitory pathway. It's going to be involved with regulation of body temperature, sleep-wake, mood, appetite, and pain. What ends up happening is that when we have food being consumed, the serotonergic pathway is going to increase, whereas the dopaminergic pathway is going to decrease, leading to that sense of lethargy that we have when we eat. Now, we talked about the dopaminergic pathway leading to changes of arousal in terms of wanting risk-reward. The serotonergic pathway is going to be linked with that, which means that in terms of addictive behavior, the serotonergic pathway and the dopaminergic pathway kind of act like a seesaw between the two, where we're in a constant flux between serotonin and dopamine in terms of whether or not we want to do things in terms of that risk reward. The last of the pathways we're going to look at are more diffuse pathways, which means that they're not coming from distinct regions. They're kind of found across and within the limbic system and within the midbrain structures and then out into the cerebral cortex. These include the GABA pathway. The GABA pathway is an inhibitory pathway. It's a generalized inhibitory pathway. This is the pathway that gets activated when we consume toxins. In particular, we consume ethanol as a toxin. And it leads to all of the inhibitory complexes that we see coming out within consumption of ethanol, alcohol. Now, the interesting thing is that while it's going to inhibit things like, say, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex, it actually leads to activation of things like the amygdala. It's also going to inhibit the cerebellar peduncles, which is why when people consume alcohol, they start having issues with coordination. On the other hand, we have the glutamate pathway. Now, peripherally, glutamate acts as an inhibitory neurotransmitter, however, essentially acts as an excitatory neurotransmitter. When the RAS starts to fire, when the noradrenergic pathway activates, one of the places it's going to activate is within the substantia nigra, which triggers a release of glutamate. And what this does is this diffuses through the entirety of the cerebral cortex, and it basically gets all of the neurons to start firing. Basically, hey, it's time to wake up, time to get going. This is the same substance that we saw when we looked at the sprouting of the dendrites in class. This is the same substance that causes the sprouting to take place. And so what's happening is that when it gets released, it's going to cause increased activation of all of the neurons that it comes in contact with. So it's going to be involved with our waking up and within our regulated level of activation to this within the cerebral cortex.